She asked not to tell anyone about what happened, so as to avoid punishment, and it would remain their secret. Kazuro silently rolled his eyes, agreeing with all her words. Indignant faces looked at the behavior of the couple and were very jealous of Kazuro, saying that the first year had just entered and had already got his hands on the most beautiful girl in the university. Another guy, looking away, notices another beauty walking in their direction. The boy blushed from such beauty. His comrade had not yet noticed the girl. He was focused on another lucky guy with a very beautiful girl. It was Hanami. She didn't look like a thief at all, but like a very beautiful girl. Her green eyes were very beautiful, and her multicolored ponytails fluttered in the wind. She walked towards Kazuro, holding a bottle of yellow liquid in her hands. Approaching him and taking him by the shoulder, she greeted him and offered him a drink. Kazuro was so surprised by the appearance of the Hanami that he was speechless. He was glad to see her. The guys standing around began to cry with grief that the freshman had so many girls and they were so pretty. He doesn't do anything and they just stick to him. "Why is the world so unfair?" they shouted. Others, seeing how lucky Kazuro was, began to leave with their girls so that they would not be jealous of such beauties. Hanami notices that Kazuro already has a bottle of water and is leaving. It was a waste of time to come. Realizing his failure, Hanami becomes a little angry. At this time, Kazuro thinks that if he introduces them to each other, maybe they will become friends. While Kazuro looked at Sarah telling her about Hanami, what a beautiful girl she was, Hanami herself turned around and decided to leave without disturbing them. Noticing that Hanami began to leave, throwing a bottle of something yellow over her, Kazuro was surprised and did not understand what to do. Hanami was upset and thought that Kazuro was a creep and was clearly interested in other girls. Kazuro stood there not understanding what to do. He didn't know what the problem was because he had never been in a situation like this. There wasn't even a thought in his head that he had done wrong, that he had offended Hanami. Sarah decided to cheer up Kazuro by saying that he needed to catch up with the girl and explain everything to her. Otherwise, he would lose her and the friendship would end. Kazuro decided to listen to Sarah's words and talk to Hanami. Picking up the bottle from the ground, he began to catch up with Hanami to talk. Hanami was already terribly annoyed and thought only about all sorts of nasty things about Kazuro. Having caught up with Hanami, he began to drink her drink with great pleasure, not knowing what it was. In his head, he only thought that he wanted to see her smile and joy. Hanami stood very tense. Steam was coming from her head. She was very unhappy with Kazuro and wanted to hit him hard. Kazuro looked, not knowing what to say, and just stood behind. Sarah looked at Kazuro's pathetic attempts to apologize, and she felt ashamed. She realized that the boy had no idea how to care for girls, and apparently this was their first fight. Hanami remembered her mother's relationship and was afraid to repeat it. Hanami thought that Kazuro was a very good person and would not betray her, but she could not see other girls next to him. Although she understood that they were not boyfriend and girlfriend at all, she was still hurt. Grabbing Hanami's hand, Kazuro began to try to apologize, not understanding why. He began to explain that Sarah was the senior student who had met them upon arrival at the university and given them a tour. Hanami was not satisfied with this answer, and she only took her hand back, thereby making Kazuro think, and he told about the evening story with the hooligans, and that Sarah simply gave him water in gratitude for his assistance in catching the criminals. After Kazuro added that the drink is very tonic and quickly restores strength, he wondered what it was. With great pleasure, Kazuro began to finish the bottle of cool drink. Enjoying every drop, he was very grateful to Hanami for such a gift and thanked her after every sip. Looking at the insatiable Kazuro and apologizing after every sip, Hanami was annoyed by this, and she began to shout at him to stop, and she would tell him where he got the drink. There is a dragon monastery in the mountains. It is ancient and few people go there. When her mother took her to the monastery to taste the healing drink flowing from the dragon's mouth, it increased the power of control and consciousness, made the body more collected and alert. There she took it for Kazuro. Kazuro listened carefully to Hanami's words, and he was pleased that she did so much for him, that she treated him so well, and he wanted her to stay. Hanami puffed out her cheeks and looked to the side, pretending to sulk at him. Kazuro decided to ask Hanami to take him to the monastery, and show him that place. Hanami had doubts and decided to refuse the guy, hinting that he would not receive anything else. Kajuro started looking at her with puppy dog eyes and begging Hanami. The girl began to understand that she was probably too hasty with her conclusions because he was just her friend. Taking the bottle from his hands, Hanami agreed to bring him another drink later and suggested meeting him in the evening after school, near the exit from the campus. Kajuro agreed with great pleasure, because he already wanted to spend more time with her. He waves after her and is glad that she smiles. It was a nice feeling, hearing from the outside how they were making fun of him. They started laughing that he didn't even know how to talk to girls, much less express his feelings and give compliments. That Kazuro felt ashamed, and it felt like they started throwing stones and shooting arrows at him. He walked past the guys, who were filled with envy and a lack of understanding why. They all wanted to be in his place and would know exactly what to say to such beauties. Kajuro looked at the reactions of his classmates and thought that he could ask Hanami not to come during lessons. There would be less risk of being discovered and arousing suspicion. Moreover, someone might recognize her, since she is a criminal. Evening has come. Kazuro with Hanami and her monster are flying to a new, interesting place that Hanami has found. The place did not look romantic, more like a cemetery or ruins. Kazuro looked a little apprehensive. He thought that they would somehow spend the evening more romantically. Hanami was having fun and was looking forward to arriving at the place. Hanami finally saw a suitable landing spot and told her monster to sit down. Kajuro, not understanding where Hanami had led them, looked in surprise and in anticipation of something abnormal. Landing in the middle of the swamp, Hanami approached a huge tree entwined with vines and dry branches. Kajuro stood behind, not understanding why they were here. While helping clear the branches of a tree, Kajuro and Hanami see a cave with bats flying out of it. The guys got a little scared and started covering themselves with their hands. Hanami looked contentedly into the cave and enthusiastically prepared to go there. Kajuro looked at what was happening, not understanding what they forgot here, but he could not dispute Hanami's desire and simply wanted to be with her. Kajuro didn't understand where Hanami was leading him, but he followed her. The surroundings were damp and slippery, and they began to descend down the slippery slope. The descent ended with a hole in the wall, into which our guys successfully flew and ended up in the room. It was a very fun trip. Kazuro notes that the room they found themselves in was furnished. In the middle there was a large tent. Next to it there was a cooking table and a tripod over the fire. They were met by old acquaintances who kidnapped him. The driver sat near the fire, and the pumped-up guy who had lost his leg in the battle against Kazuro stood on crutches. They looked at the guy with apprehension, but accepted the decision of their leader. Kajuro felt a little uncomfortable, since he was responsible for the loss of the guy's leg. Now they were allies with a bad history together. He thought that they would not accept him and would avoid him or even betray him. The pumped-up guy greeted Kajuro with the words that he lost honorably, having underestimated his opponent. Kazuro felt relieved and responded with mutual respect and an apology to make up for the guilt he felt. Kazuro was surprised to hear a familiar voice from the tent. Turning to it, he saw his classmate, who had lost his arm while fighting a monster with a chainsaw. Kajuro was surprised to see him here and began to ask how he got here. The boy began to tell how after the exam, his life went downhill and he wanted to commit suicide, but at one point Hanami met him and saved him. Having accepted into her team, she promised to help and channel her strength in the right direction by helping others. Kajuro looked at Hanami and realized that she was doing a very important job, saving people. Her kind heart only made her fall in love with herself more. After the heartwarming story of classmate Hanami giving a tour to Kazuro shows where she collected water. Kajuro looked at the dragon head statue and noticed that it was strange. Hanami said that this dragon head serves not only as a water channel, but also as a lock on the huge doors of the tomb. Kajuro was shocked, realizing that he had been drinking water from the tomb. There were thoughts in my head to at least not catch some infection from the past. The guys said that the tomb had been found a long time ago, but no one managed to open it. Apparently, she was under the strong effect of protective magic, and it was impossible to get there. Kazuro, activating the red-eye effect to explore and identify weaknesses, began to roll up his sleeve to summon a monster with a chainsaw. He expected to open the tomb and explore. He was haunted by the desire to see what was hiding behind the doors. Using the monster's strongest attack with a chainsaw, the power level increased tenfold for a short time, but it didn't help at all. Sparks shot out in all directions. Incredible power fell on the statue. After such a powerful attack, Kajuro and the monster with the chainsaw looked at the statue in surprise. There wasn't even a scratch on it, apparently. The protective magic here was of the highest level and was not subject to attacks. Kazuro's stupid attempts and said that they themselves had tried everything before him. No one will be able to open this door with attacks. All that is needed is magic of the same level as the protection spell on the door, realizing that they are most likely right. Kajuro reabsorbs the chainsaw monster. He begins to think what to use in this case and begins to examine the statue. Feeling a strange feeling from the statue, he decides to touch the statue with his hand. She looked so familiar, and Kazuro thought that he had seen her somewhere in his childhood. Unexpectedly for the guys, the bolts on the door began to move and the door opened. Stale air and dust immediately began to escape from the long-closed room. Kazuro was extremely surprised that he could open the door with one touch. This greatly surprised him. The guys behind were shocked that the boy managed to open the door. Without thinking twice, the guys decided to go into the room to be the first to see the secrets of the tomb. There were many statues of old-world knights around. The size of the room was amazing. It was dark inside, but the light from the huge open door illuminated a huge corridor between the statues of warriors. The guys stood near the door, looking around the room. At the end, there was a tall staircase leading to a pedestal under a huge engraved arch. On that pedestal stood what looked like a coffin. The guys saw a huge number of warriors guarding the room and decided that this was the tomb of some ruler or commander. Looking at the warriors and the room of the tomb, Kazuro decided to go to the stairs to the top and see who was lying in the coffin. After the first steps, goosebumps ran through Kazuro's body. He heard strange sounds coming from the statue warriors. There was a thought in his head that it was a trap, and he was caught. Hanami was scared for the guy when she also heard strange sounds. She started screaming for him to retreat as quickly as possible. Her heart began to beat faster, because she had not yet told Kazuro about her feelings. She really didn't want something to happen to him. Fearing the worst, Kajuro narrowed his eyes and stood frozen in place. The statues, making terrible creaking sounds, sat down on one knee in front of the guy, showing their respect to him. The surprised expression on Kazuro's face at what he saw showed his confusion at the situation. He didn't understand what was happening. Why did the statues start bowing to him? Red Eye began to suspect that the boy was not as simple as he seemed, and maybe he had strong ancestors with incredible abilities for absorber magic. The guys stood behind, not understanding what was happening, why the statues suddenly came to life and bowed to Kazuro. Hanami, worried about the boy, held on to the pendant that her mother gave her. The guy in the suit decided to go too, but the statue reacted by getting up from his knee and pointing a spear at him. He was very scared and did not move. They realized that the statues would not let them through. Apparently only Kajuro was allowed to enter. Having blocked the road with spears, the statues stood quietly and controlled the actions of the children. Hanami, worried about Kajuro, asked him to be careful and not do reckless things. Kazuro begins to notice that there were murals around with the history of the great man. He began to guess that the guy's assumptions were true and that a very influential man of the old era really lay here. Kazuro began to tell the guys what was painted on the frescoes and paintings around them. A warlike and strong warrior leading a huge army of warriors. The shiny blade and furious gaze caused only fear in the enemies. In another picture, it was clear that, having gone through hundreds of warriors, he defeated thousands of warriors and fought very fiercely, leaving no chance for the enemy. His actions before the enemy were ruthless. He cut off the heads of their commanders in front of the warriors' eyes, forcing them to fear and bow to the greatest warrior. Years later, he sat on a hill, leaning against a tree and enjoying the greatest country he served. Having defeated so many warriors, he saw the dawn of an empire and pride that all this was not in vain. Climbing the stairs, Kazuro was amazed at such a great man. The huge tomb was worthy of a great warrior. But why was it closed with high-level magic? Kazuro thought as he stood up. Rising, Kazuro saw a coffin in the middle of the pedestal. There was nothing around, no offerings or weapons or decorations. Just a coffin, and that's it. Approaching closer, a blue glow and a menacing voice began to be released from the coffin. Kazuro became very tense, because the ghost of such a great man could have unimaginable power. A huge blue ghost rose from the grave. He looked at the boy with an aggressive look. His soul did not realize that he had already died and was looking for his home, asking the guy where the city of Fuji was and was it safe. The city that the ghost asked about was a beautiful provincial town, famous for its rice fields. But once it was a large and beautiful city. About 100 years ago, the ruling clan of the Crow at that time attacked the city of Fuji and burned it. The entire history of the city was lost under the houses burned to ash. Kazuro read this in 10th grade history class. The ghost who learned about this was very upset. He lived defending his beloved city from enemies, but it was burned and a small village was built in its place. Emotions of anger were overflowing. Unimaginable power began to be released from the ghost's soul. It was very difficult to resist the power of the ghost's magical power. Rays of power began to hit in all directions and blind with their sowing. The guys standing at the entrance could not stand on their feet because of what they saw and began to fall. They had never seen such power and were afraid that it would break out and discover them. Having pierced the mountain and formed a huge hole in the ceiling, the enormous power began to illuminate the night sky and was visible for a very long distance. Nobody expected this. Meanwhile, in the office of the head of the absorbers, there was a serious conversation with Director Lin about the missing couple of escaped absorbers. Suddenly they were interrupted by a pillar of light rising in the sky. Feeling the enormous power of the force from the radiance, the head of the absorbers was extremely worried that such a force had appeared in the world and began to think about doing something. Director Lin was also surprised. He began to remember that he was in that direction, and guess where the light came from? The head of the absorbers orders to send all people to the place of power and find out the source if possible, remove them and not leave witnesses. Director Lin agrees with the order and begins execution. Kajuro's parents saw a bright light in the sky and suspected that it might be their son. They knew what was in the tomb, and only their son from their ancestors had access. The father was very glad that his son finally matured and found the entrance to the tomb. Mom, realizing that if their son was able to find the tomb and open it, then not only they saw such power, now Kajuro will be in danger if he is found and finds out who his parents are. The father gradually began to lose joy from his face, and concern for the safety of his son, he decides to act. Taking his sickle from the stump, the father already imagined what he would do to those who would harm his son. His gaze expressed an abnormal attitude towards people who prevented them from living in peace. His straw farmer's hat looked a little shabby, and the towel around his neck showed his hard work and dedication to his work. In the tomb, the guys were very worried about what was happening. They looked at the beam, knowing that Kajuro was there. Realizing that such a glow would be visible far away, they decided to hurry Kazuro and run away from here. Hanami tried to see Kajuro through the bright beam and make sure that he was not hurt. Understanding the concern of her comrades, she agreed to hurry the guy and run. Kajuro stood in fear, not understanding what to do. Such power is probably beyond anyone's control, Kazuro thought. Red Eye stood behind, clinging to the guy. He had also never seen such power. Having collected himself, the Red Eye told the guy that the spirit belonged to the object inside the coffin. Kazuro, fearing, began to understand the Red Eye, but it was very difficult to get closer. Near the skeleton of the deceased ghost lay a sword exuding unimaginable power. This was the ghost's object. If you take possession of it, you can subdue the ghost, said the Red Eye. Being next to the body of the dead man, Kazuro and the Red Eye, afraid, decide to act. The power of the glow began to increase. It was necessary to act urgently. The red voice said that a drop of blood was needed to subdue the ghost. Being very worried and unsure of his actions, Kajuro decides to bite his finger to draw a drop of blood. Looking at the sword with beautiful designs and gems, Kajuro brings his hand to it and applies a drop of blood. The enormous power of the ghost begins to weaken and thicken over Kazuro. The guy, realizing that something was going wrong, became very tense and began to move away. Enormous power begins to fly into Kajuro's body at great speed. The guy, feeling the horror of what he saw, begins to feel severe pain in his body. The disappearing ray into Kazuro's body knocks out the guy and he falls into the coffin. Hanami, seeing what happened, was very scared and decides to do something. Realizing that the guy needs to be saved and get out of here, Hanami decides to use her monster. The guys standing behind her begin to encourage her and remind her that they don't have much time. Hanami begins to summon a flying demon-like monster to fly over the crowd of warrior statues and save the guy. Climbing onto the monster's back, Hanami, worried about Kajuro, orders the monster to fly faster to help. Dodging the attacks of the warrior statues, the monster with Hanami begins to approach the pedestal with the coffin where Kazuro fell. Having spilled over the last soldiers, the monster and the Khans began to fly along the stairs, rising towards the guy. The soldiers did not pursue them. Apparently they were tied to the place and could not get up. Rising to Kajuro, Hanami jumps off his monster and rushes to the rescue. She is very worried about the guy and wants to scold him for his stupid actions. She saw Kajuro lying inside the coffin in a state of shock. His eyes were wide open, as was his mouth. He was breathing, but was not conscious. Hanami looked at the guy with horror on her face, afraid that everything was very bad. Understanding that she needs to leave quickly, she begins to try to lift the guy up. Grabbing Kajuro by the hand, Hanami tries to lean him on his back to make it easier to drag him. Using all her strength, the girl tries to save the boy. While the guys are trying to get out of the tomb, mercenaries of the head of the absorbers have already gathered on the street to catch or take away the light source. While going down the stairs, the monster held Kajuro's body in his arms. The soldiers did not block their path, but knelt and bowed. Hanami sat on the monster's back and told him to hurry up. The guys began to get out of the tomb in their cave together, hoping to escape the pursuit of the mercenaries of the head of the scavengers. Meanwhile, the mercenaries of the head of the absorbers were already beginning to divide into groups and inspect the entire territory in search of suspicious individuals, parking your cars almost throughout the cemetery. Rising outside, the guys saw that they were already looking for them. Hanami kept Kajuro in an incomprehensible state and was very worried. The guys looked around and thought where to go. Sitting near the high slab of the grave, the guys noticed the glow of a flashlight and a crowd of people walking in their direction. The guys began to urgently think about what to do. One of the guys looked at Kazuro and realized that it would be difficult for them to leave with such a load. There will be little chance of salvation. He wanted to leave the guy, but he understood that there would be many who disagreed with his decision. Hanami realized that it would be difficult to escape, but she could not leave Kajuro. His condition frightened the girl very much, because she didn't know how to help. Classmate Kajuro agreed with Hanami's words that they were not going to abandon anyone. He decided to divert the attention of the police and give his comrades a chance to escape. He stood proudly, looking towards the enemy, realizing that this could be their last meeting, and wished them good luck in their rescue and achieve their goal in saving people from injustice. The guys decided not to leave their partner to the mercy of fate and help him. The goal was to save Hanami and Kajuro from the enemy by allowing them to escape. Hanami was greatly concerned by the devotion of her comrades that tears began to form in her eyes. She thanked them for such a chance and asked them to be careful and not get caught by the enemy. The guys, with a proud smile, realizing their choice, rushed to distract the enemy. Each of them set themselves the goal of helping the weak and wounded. Stop bad people from continuing to rule the system and the world. Running in different directions to distract as many policemen as possible, Hanami told them after them that she was worried about them and in tears begged them not to take risks and to save themselves. One of the guys had already approached the police and began to run, distracting them further, falling under the flashlight beam and provoking the cops. A classmate who had lost his arm also found a group of cops and began to distract him by running and insulting those who were not competent. Unable to withstand criticism, they rushed to catch up with the impudent boy. Realizing that the enemies were distracted, Hanami, calling on her flying monster, quietly began to leave, observing the situation. She looked at the many beams from the flashlights and hoped that her friends would be able to escape and not get caught by the enemy. Hanami was very worried about them and prayed all the time for their lives. Meanwhile, Director Lin sat in the car awaiting results from his men. Calmly observing the situation, he was not worried because his people had cordoned off the entire territory and would not let anyone through. Noticing the glow from the monster's mana in the sky, he ominously looked after them and decided to take action. This time he didn't want to let anyone go, so as not to embarrass himself in front of the head of the absorbers. Rolling up the sleeve on his arm, he decides to summon his monster so as not to let the fugitives go. His consumed monster was a pack of high-ranking wolves, capable of catching up to anyone and even in the air. The ominous appearance of their huge mouths and bluish radiance made everyone who caught their eyes terrified. The flying monster with Hanami and Kazuro in its arms did not feel any threats and flew calmly, trying not to attract attention. Behind them, a pack of wolves was approaching them to attack. Sensing the ominous presence of another monster nearby, the flying monster turns around and notices that it is being followed. Hanami also pays attention and, realizing that her monster will not be able to fight while carrying the two of them, begins to think about what to do. The wolves were very fast, and having caught up with the monster and the guys, they hit him hard in the back. The flying monster almost missed Kajuro, and Hanami, out of fear, began to try to pick up the boy herself. The flying monster, trying to protect the guys, grabbed them tightly so that a pack of wolves would not get to them. He couldn't fly faster yet, unless his owner asked him to. Suddenly, one of the wolves slips past the flying monster's defenses and bites Hanami's barrel. She screams in pain and is afraid that they will not be able to escape. It was too far to the shelter, and she had to make a decision very quickly. Director Lin, smiling insidiously that his monsters are coping and won't let the guys escape, decides to quickly finish off the monster and drive the guys into a remote corner to grab it. The flying monster uses its clenches to fight back, and not letting the enemy in, fights with all its might. He can't stand being surrounded by a pack for long. Having bypassed the flying monster on 3 sides, the wolves prepared to attack and finally land the fugitives. Hanami, having received a severe wound and trying not to lose consciousness, tells his monster to fly to the Fu Fel University, hoping to take refuge there. Realizing that they have no other choice, she asks the monster to channel its remaining power into speed and quickly. Agreeing with the owner, the flying monster channels its power into speed and dash. Catching the wolves by surprise with her sudden movement and starting to break away, Hanami hoped that this would help and they would leave. Director Lin sees the monster's actions and, without worrying, knows that the wolves cannot be easily escaped. They are also fast and will find the target by smell. Having caught up with the flying monster very quickly, a pack of wolves immediately attacked the monster, tearing off pieces of glowing flesh. Finally, Fu Fel University appeared. Its buildings stood in pitch darkness, as it was deep night outside. The hope that someone would come to help was very dim. Receiving another portion of blows from a pack of wolves, the flying monster, hugging the guys, begins to fall from powerlessness. Having fallen to the ground, Hanami was already too exhausted to do anything. The wound was deep, and she urgently needed to see a doctor. Kajuro was still unconscious and unable to help. Holding on to the guys with all his strength, the monster prepared for the last attack of the wolves and understood that he would die. Suddenly, another monster appears above him and saves him, repelling the attack of the wolves. It was the headless monster of high school student Sarah. The wolves retreated, sensing the superiority of the enemy, and did not attack. While on patrol around the university, she noticed monsters fighting in the sky and hurried to check. Seeing the familiar faces of Hanami and Kazuro in the arms of the fallen monster, Sarah was worried and horrified by the injuries and understood that they needed medical help as soon as possible. Sarah stood in horror and didn't know where to start. It was too dangerous for her to leave the guys alone for help. But without help, they would be finished. She was frightened and didn't know what to do. The sound of police car sirens could be heard in the background as they drove up to the main entrance to catch the fugitives and interrogate them. Sarah, realizing that no one has the right to enter the university without the director's permission, decided to cover her comrades by standing in front of them. She looked at the crowd of cops near their cars and did not understand what was happening. Sarah stood in front of the entrance, preparing to fight back, but realizing the numerical superiority of the police people, she tried to negotiate. The policeman rudely ordered the fugitives to be given to them and not to interfere. Otherwise, she would marry an accomplice and would also be caught. Sarah, realizing that something is wrong here and the cops are not so rude, decides not to hand the guys over, but to advise them to get out of here for the good. The territory is closed to outsiders, and they have no right to enter here without the permission of the director. The suspicious men took a fighting stance, and threatening Sarah that she would be in trouble, began to roll up their sleeves to summon their monsters. Meanwhile, Sarah has already stood behind her headless monster to repel the enemy. Too confident in their abilities, the guys begin to call upon their monsters to teach the impudent girl a lesson and take the suspects in the situation to the cemetery. A crowd of monsters rose above dozens of suspicious people to attack the girl and her monster. Although the monsters were not of high rank, there were too many of them. Suddenly, Director Sota stands in front of Sarah and, with his confident appearance, decides to help and repel the attack on his students. Using a top-level spell, Director Sota creates a solar whirlwind in an attempt to force the enemy to retreat a little and regroup for further action. But the power of his technique will scatter enemies in different directions, leaving them no chance to win. With an incredible move, he caused the attackers to become frightened and retreat. The incredible force of the whirlwind even overturned cars. Director Sota himself stood with his hands behind his back and looked at the actions of the attackers. Director Sota asked Sarah to urgently deliver the victims to the infirmary and ensure safety, and he would try to deal with the enemies himself. Without any indignation, Hanami immediately agrees with the director and begins the task. Sarah and her monster grabbed Kajuro and Hanami and quickly moved to the infirmary. Because of the noise, the lights in the dorm began to turn on, and the children began to leave their rooms on the balcony to find out what was happening. They were surprised to see the principal standing against a crowd of police officers and an injured classmate. The children continued to go out to the balcony to see what was happening, and Han's roommate also came out to the balcony. He leads the wounded Kajuro, who is being dragged by Sarah, and senses a strong aura from the guy. It was familiar to him, as such power usually belongs to warriors, but Kajuro's power was much stronger than Han had ever felt. Finally, Director Lin approaches the attackers to look at the one who dared to interfere with them in capturing the criminals. Principal Suda suggested that the attackers leave on good terms and not approach his students again, otherwise they will be severely punished. Director Lin was surprised by such arrogant impudence and suggested that the old man go aside and not disturb him, otherwise he would be arrested for attacking the absorbers and sentenced to execution. Director Sota responded to the threats with a calm phrase and an expression of concern for the attackers, as they did not stand a chance. Director Lin, hearing the old man's confident words, only made him angrier and ordered his men to release the monsters and attack the arrogant old man. Rolling up their sleeves again and starting to summon the absorbed monsters, Director Lin's mercenaries prepared to attack with all their might and teach the old man a lesson. Director Sota realizes that his opponent has chosen the worst option and begins to roll up his sleeves and remove the bandages from his arms. Director Sota owned many powerful monsters and was once a very famous scavenger, but now he is a simple director of the little-known Fuful University. Director Lin's mercenaries summoned their monsters and prepared to attack. Looking at the old man's enormous strength, they tensed a little, but realizing that there were more of them, they were ready to attack and waited for a command from Director Lin. Dozens of mid-level monsters, after Director Lin's order, rushed to attack the old man with the desire only to kill. Director Sota, having summoned his high-level monsters to intimidate the enemy and leave without a fight, realizes that they do not realize their mistake in engaging him in battle. Seeing the crowd of monsters running, Director Sota uses his Monster Sage. The Monster Sage was a monster of the highest level and possessed incredible powers. He was able to use his ink brush to cast spells on the enemy, thereby stopping or increasing the damage to them from his allies. This is what old Sota took advantage of. Swiping his huge brush through the crowd of fleeing monsters, he casts a spell of vulnerability on all enemy monsters. The Scythe Woman monster is ordered by Director Sota to use the cutting mill attack. The sight of a skeleton in a dress and hair with a braid began to glow. using a strong attack move before attacking. Having rushed at great speed, cutting through all the monsters like paper, the monster with the scythe was very strong, and it was impossible for such mediocre monsters to repel her attack. Seeing the crowd of hacked monsters, the attackers were shocked and feared that they were finished. Some began to run immediately after what they saw. The rest had not yet recovered from what they saw. Director Lin was shocked that so many monsters were killed by only 2 monsters. His gaze was filled with fear because he had never seen such strong absorbers. Deciding that they don't stand a chance, Director Lin orders everyone to retreat and escape from here. Nada would come up with another plan for attack. At least they knew where to look for the fugitives. Director Sota, realizing that the enemy was retreating, did not pursue, but wondered why they were pursuing Kojuro and the girl. Something strange happened, and it was necessary to check the condition of the guys. Meanwhile, the mercenaries got into their battered cars and began to retreat, leaving a huge, dark trail of ash on the asphalt from the dead monsters. Making sure that the enemy had retreated, the director turned around. The entire dorm stood on the balconies and loudly applauded and shouted to the director. Seeing how strong and powerful he was, the guys were glad to learn from such a master absorber and director of the Fufel University. Meanwhile, the cars with the mercenaries raced further to quickly return to the main headquarters and think over a plan for further action. Director Lin decided to call the head of the absorbers and tell him what happened. The situation got out of control once it entered the university territory. The head of the saddle absorbers is sitting on a chair in his office. Picking up the phone from Director Lin's call, he was surprised that they were again unable to capture the fugitives. He began to doubt Director Lin's competence again and show his dissatisfaction. Director Lin began to make excuses that they were prevented by a very strong absorber, which he had not heard of before. It was the director of the Fufel school, and he had many absorbed monsters, about 8. His people were not prepared for such an enemy, which is why they lost. The head of the absorbers, hearing that Director Sota had interfered with them, smiled. He remembers him in his youth, because they fought together against monsters. The mighty Sota was the most powerful warrior and absorber at the time of their joint study with the head of the absorbers. Once upon a time, Sota could fight any monsters alone, and always won. Even the other absorbers were afraid of him, because when they challenged him in the arena, they always lost. Director Lin, hearing that the head knew the director of Fufel, was surprised and shocked that such a powerful man became the director of a little-known university. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, the head of the absorbers orders Director Lin to retreat and infiltrate his people into the university system in order to trace and find out where the fugitives are being kept and kidnap the target. Director Lin, having heard that undercover students would be infiltrated, offered his children as candidates as an apology for the failure of the operation. To which the head of the absorbers replied that he had already done this, supporting their duo with his daughter so that she would look after them. The head of the absorbers sat in his chair with his phone down. His face showed concern, and the flooding memories of Director Soth were also the reason for this. Kazuro's father, meanwhile, was already at the station to get to the city and keep an eye on his son. Walking down the corridor, he wanted to sneeze. It was a strange feeling, as if someone were remembering, the father thought. Sarah had already taken Kojuro and Hanami to the infirmary, where they were receiving medical attention. She was worried about Kojuro because the boy was frozen in a state of shock and did not wake up. Director Sota came into the office to make sure the guys were safe. He began to suspect that Kojuro had an excess of spiritual power and needed to release it a little to help the boy. Taking the sacred needle out of his pocket, Director Sota recalled how he had used such a thing before. He hoped this would help the guy. Having inserted the tip of the needle into a certain point on Kazuro's face, power began to ooze from the wound in blood-red waves, freeing itself from the body. After the procedure, Director Sota began to leave, saying that now he had to wait. Sarah decided to cover the guy and pulled the blanket. The director notices the logos of the absorbed monsters on Kajuro's hand and sees a very strange monster mark. This frightened him greatly, and he automatically attacked Kojuro, not paying attention to his surroundings. Sarah was afraid that the director attacked the guy without any reason. Director Sota was horrified by what he had done and removed his trembling hand. Having not managed to commit the terrible thing, he decides to leave. Turning his head to the surprised Sarah, the director apologized for what he had done and said that it seemed to him that the boy had been captured by something and that he wanted to test this theory. Director Sota looked at the guy with caution and felt a very powerful force in him that was beyond anyone's control. He was afraid that the boy would not survive, but for such a long time, the monster did not manifest itself, which means that the guy might be able to subjugate him. Such a creature. Warm, sunny day. Children are running and having fun while their parents are working in the field. The village is surrounded by high mountains and protects from strong winds. The village was attacked. Many houses were burned to ashes. All residents were killed without pity. The valley was filled with thick, acrid smoke, saturated with blood. The palace was attacked. All the warriors were brutally killed, and the armed attackers entered the main hall of the palace. In front of them stood a woman with a baby and a boy clinging to her dress. They looked like royalty. They stood near the throne of the village governor and showed no fear. The woman was very beautiful, with a large gold necklace and a majestic dress. She stood proudly with her children and awaited her imminent death without showing any fear. Suddenly, Kazuro opens his eyes. He is scared because he doesn't understand what kind of dream it was, and why was it so real. When he saw that his friend woke up, he was happy and cried with happiness. He was glad to finally be sure that Kajuro had woken up when he was nearby. He jumped to hug his best friend and cry with happiness. Kajuro was shocked by his friend's strong affection and expression of emotion that he tried to stop him and ask him to calm down. Po began to say that Kajuro slept for about 2 days in the infirmary. Everyone was very worried that he would not wake up, and Po came every day and told how his day went. Hearing coughing from the next bed, Kajuro notices a guy covered in bandages. Po says that this guy has been here for a week. Someone severely maimed him by throwing him off the roof. The bandaged guy with a bad mood remembers Kajuro because he and his partner beat him up like that. Kajuro remembered that this was the guy in the blue jacket who forced his girlfriends to fight them, and he tried to climb down from the roof and fell when Han cut the monster's threads. Po looked at the bandaged man and remembered that he had been strangled in his sleep with some threads and that he was probably involved. The bandaged guy became a little nervous, realizing that they could do something else with him. Kajuro remembered that he was with Hanami in the cave then, but she was not nearby, and he asked Po where she was. In the background, the door to the room opened, and Sarah stood at the entrance. She came with a bottle of water. Hearing Kajuro's words, she said that Hanami had suffered greatly while saving him, and she was lying in a separate room under a life support system. Kajuro was very scared for Hanami and decided to get up and check on his friend. His legs did not listen to him, and he fell. Sarah told him not to rush so much and better lie down. He still wouldn't be able to help Hanami yet. The bandaged guy, seeing Kajuro fall, began to laugh loudly at him and say that he was also weak. Kajuro turned to him, rising with Sarah's help, and said that he had simply been lying there for too long and his legs were a little weak. Already standing on his own 2 feet, Kajuro, not listening to the advice of his friends, decides to go to Hanami. Passing by the bandaged man, he gives him a slap on his broken leg. In pain, the boy begins to scream. Po stands there, smiling maliciously with the words just right for him. Sarah is concerned about Kajuro's condition and stands watching in surprise. Walking into the next room, behind the glass of which lies Hanami. Her condition is stable and serious. Kajuro is worried about her and wants to help in some way. Sarah followed him and stood behind him, watching and realizing that they could not do anything yet. Sarah reveals that Hanami dragged Kajuro to the university and received severe injuries. Doctors are doing everything possible to save her, but for now, she must fight for her life herself. The wounds were very severe. Apparently, she was bitten by the wolf that Sarah was able to drive away when they set foot on the university grounds. Kajuro stood, holding back his anger that he could not save her. He decides to take revenge on the mercenaries for the harm they caused to his friends. Realizing that they suffered while saving him, Kajuro did not want to remain in debt and deal with the damned mercenaries. Walking down the corridor, reflecting on his actions, Kajuro stumbles upon Director Sota. He offered to follow him and discuss what had happened. Kajuro was too overcome with emotions and said that he did not have time to talk. He had to quickly find a way to save Hanami.